Thank you, Andy. Okay then, so I do need a clicker, perfect, excellent. Okay, so normally I get tasked with the awkward presentations and conferences, and this one will be no different. My challenge in the run-up to this was how to weight the implication of inflation and cost of living crisis on how consumers are going to subscribe to pay TV and to streaming TV. Fortunately for me, but less fortunately for consumers, we've got depends how you define it, a mini or a major financial crisis unfolding at the moment. And we also have the Federal Reserve meeting today to decide whether to continue to increase interest rates or reduce them. We have the Bank of England meeting on Thursday with a similar challenge. So with that in mind, I'm going to go straight into the presentation. Okay, so it's the subscription economy in an inflationary era, and I'm going to look at 4 different things. So, give you an overview of the macro picture. So, we're going to go out, and then we're going to go in. So, after the macro overview, we're going to look at a snapshot of MIDiA's data around subscription video engagements. We're then going to move on to a bit more kind of free thinking, blue sky thinking about retention. Because a key theme of this presentation is going to be, how do you keep your subscribers? You've run them, you put a lot of effort into that, a lot of ROI. You need to get the return on that investment in an era where we've got, in some markets, double-digit inflation, we have a cost of living crisis, we've got uncertainty, we've also got market saturation as well. So retention is absolutely crucial. And we're going to look at some of the themes that MIDiA has been developing over the last 6 months across the digital entertainment landscape to give some context and some guidelines to how to win at the retention game in 2023. And finally, I'll wrap up with some implications. So, here's my first slide. So, just to set the scene. So, we've got 3 discrete phases here for what MIDiA calls the evolution of the streaming TV era, which is where streaming services have become mainstream for consumers. Now, back in 2007, Netflix made its pivot into the streaming on-demand model, and that set up a whole catalyst of change, culminating what MIDiA called the DTC Big Bang moment of 2019 to 2021, where a lot of the incumbents also launched their own direct-to-consumer services to be able to compete and go where the consumers already were. Now, of course, we had COVID impacted in 2022, and we had the Great Lockdown of 2022 to 2021, which did a number of things. On the one hand, it normalized streaming because of that hiatus in real-life entertainment and the ability to be able to commute and go to work. MIDiA actually calculated that there was a 12% increase in entertainment time available during this period. And streaming TV, alongside most other forms of home entertainment behavior, benefited from this. But of course, since then, we've had the return of IRL in real-life entertainment. And we've had some early glimmers of fatigue and tiredness around remote home-based entertainment. And of course, over the last year, we've had the looming crisis around cost of living and double-digit inflation, which has impacted the digital entertainment landscape for the first time ever. There's never been double-digit inflation to factor in for digital entertainment. So that's a first. And to put it crudely, if you have 10 subscriptions and you've got 10% inflation, consumers realize they will have to cut one of those subscriptions to maintain the same standard of living in 12 months' time. These things take time to trickle through, but we're at that point 12 months in now where consumers are actively considering how to manage their digital wallets accordingly. So we're now moving into a retentionary environment. How do you keep those consumers engaged with your services, not just against other competing video services, but across the digital entertainment landscape? All other forms of digital content are now directly competing for the same finite amount of consumer digital spend. So here's a glimpse of what the subscription market looks like across nine 9 markets that MIDiA is tracking on a quarterly basis. The good news is most consumers have more than one subscription. But the less comfortable news is that's plateaued. And that's plateaued before consumers start to think about the implications of not just high interest rates and inflation, but also the uncertainty of the global economic climate as well. Now, the positive news is that MIDiA released our 2023 to 2030 forecasts at the end of last year. And we're predicting a 2/3 increase in the total number of subscriptions globally between now and 2030. So there's still significant opportunities to be able to increase the number of subscriptions and increase the footprint of direct consumer services. But the challenge is twofold. On the one hand, in mature markets such as the UK, such as the US, there is a cost of living crisis unfolding, but also there's a huge amount of competition, saturation in the market. The growth is predominantly going to come from Asia Pacific. That's going to be the fulcrum for growth over the next 8 years. And that's inevitably going to have a negative impact upon, or a dampening impact upon revenue growth for those services, because those markets have low GDP per capita, and increasingly they're more comfortable with blended propositions that include advertising as part of the proposition, which also means a dampening impact on the value of those subscriptions. So I'm going to move on to subscription, the snapshot of what subscribers are doing now, looking at MIDiA's data. So I'm going to look at the leading services that are international. So these are not all the services. These are the services which are in market in the 9 different territories where we field quarterly consumer surveys currently. And I'm just looking at how they performed over the last 4 quarters. And there's some interesting insights to be gained from here. And I think one of the most interesting things is, despite the hype, despite the negative storylines, Netflix is holding its own. Netflix has established itself as the go-to streaming video subscription provider across those 9 markets. It's got that enviable position of being mainstream and holding that mainstream position. But interestingly, the other 2 fastest the 2 fastest growers here are the tech-focused businesses. Now that presents a particular challenge for non-tech businesses and for what MIDiA describes as the media majors, the big players who live and die by being able to monetize media. Because Amazon and Apple, they fundamentally don't need to make the business model work to be able to achieve their strategic objectives of having those services in market. Take the example of Apple. Apple uses Apple TV Plus along with Apple Music, along with Apple News Plus, along with Arcade, as a retention device to be able to sell devices fundamentally. Amazon uses Amazon Prime Video as a tool to get consumers into their Prime subscriptions and using their e-commerce platform. So there's almost an asymmetrical level of competition there for the pure media players. It becomes increasingly important then to find ways to differentiate and decommodify the consumer experience to be able to compete against these well-funded operations that use media as part of the wider endgame. So the next thing I want to show you in a bit more detail is the demographic breakdown of subscribers. Now this is really interesting, and it's interesting because we're seeing the arrival of what MIDiA identified 2 years ago as the silver streamers. In 2020, 55 pluses for the first time became the biggest demographic for binge viewing for streaming services. Now, that's now translating into them actually becoming the leading fulcrum for subscriptions in the marketplace. it has positive implications for subscription values and for retention. Positive implications for subscription values because these are wealthier consumers. So they have a higher disposable income, higher discretionary income. They also are time rich as well. So they're willing to spend more time engaging with those services. They're also crucially slow to adopt and slow to leave as well. So you get this demographic on board in a subscription model. They're going to bring you more revenue. They're going to be more price elastic. They're going to spend more time consuming your content, and they're going to be less likely to move on as well. And final part about this, having a look at what the consumers are currently doing, is just a snapshot of some leading video behavior that MIDiA tracks on a quarterly basis. And the key takeaway here is, yes, we are in a streaming TV environment. Linear is in secular decline, and streaming on-demand experiences are in the ascendancy. Right then, so let's move on to the slightly more broad picture, blue sky thinking around how do you drive retention? Okay, so I'm going to look at two areas here. I'm going to look at content, and I'm going to look at community. So content, well known. We understand what content is. We understand the famous saying about content is king. Absolutely, all remains true. All is more important and relevant than it's ever been before, because we're in this saturated environment where consumers are increasingly reluctant to allocate spending for services. So as a result, content matters more than ever, but the relevance of that content also matters more than ever. You can't expect the content to work for itself anymore. The content has to be in the context of the wider digital experience of consumers, because these are digital-first consumers. They're no longer TV audiences. They are consumers that are living in digital ecosystems where they've got alternatives like games, music, news, and on and on and on. So the content has to be relevant, and it has to be accessible in a way that makes sense for them. And I'll go into a little bit of detail as to how we can do that from the community perspective. But right now, the key takeaway here is you've got to make the content relevant for digital consumers. Because MIDiA has talked a lot about digital natives in the past, these consumers who are born into a digital-first on-demand experience. We're effectively moving into the whole world being digital native now, with the silver streamers, the 55 pluses, now mainstream with digital consumption. It's no longer a dividing line to talk about non-digital and digital audiences. Everybody's a digital consumer now. So the content has to reflect that. And the final point in this section is how we identify what the content is. In the past, you created the content, you commissioned it, and then you sweated the asset across multiple different distribution models, multiple different windows, etc. In this new era, we've got consumers that actually want to be part of the content creation experience. So they actually want to use the content to be able to self-actualize their experiences online and to be able to communicate that value proposition to their peers online as well. So increasingly, content is part of that experience, and it should be looked at as an evolving experience rather than a full stop experience. So just give you some context around how that looks in a digital first environment. This comes from a report which MIDiA released last year around, we call TV Internationalization 2.0, which is why some content IP formats such as Squid Game, for example, Dark, Money Heist, have succeeded, whereas others that have come from a more traditional commissioning background have struggled to cut through in the digital landscape. Fundamentally, these kinds of content that work, they work because they have the ability to become digital assets, to live beyond the ecosystem, to let the consumers actually do the heavy lifting or promoting for them. And just to kind of illustrate what that means, we're living in an asynchronous cultural environment now. In the past, appointment to view meant limited abilities to be able to distribute content, which meant you could more or less guarantee that you'd have high quality, engaged audiences relating to the content and almost inorganically being compelled to become part of that success of that show. We've now got cultural movements. We've got clusters of super fans who may on a national basis not be significant, but on the long tail globally, they frequently add up to being much larger than the sum of a national primetime audience. And just to kind of illustrate just how complex this landscape is now becoming, algorithms are increasingly becoming the focus for how that content resonates, right down to the commissioning process, right down to decisions about where you distribute it, how you market it, who are your distribution partners, who are your audiences that you're evolving with. Do those audiences evolve over time? Do you have to then adapt that content to be relevant to those consumers? Now, the next part I'm going to move on to is community. Now, community is absolutely central because the thread running through this presentation, as well as retention, is fandom. Fandom is crucial because fandom is the secret sauce that keeps consumers engaged, not just with the content, we know that, but with the services. Because if you can create an experience that is unique to that service through the technology, through the interaction, through the enabling of the community, you've actually got the opportunity to be able to decommodify who you are and how you're presenting it. Netflix has done a really good job historically of identifying themselves as being a commissioning powerhouse that focuses on super serving niche audiences in the long tail. Now, the next stage is to go beyond that and actually think about what tools can you integrate to make sure that that fandom experience resonates with the consumer, but also enables the consumer to have a cost of leaving the service to try and engage with that content elsewhere. The equivalent outside of video is what happens in music, where you have a vested relationship with your favorite playlists with one music subscription service. So to then go and move on to another subscription service, you've got that cost associated with moving away from it. The same thing happens in games, with historically with games consoles. Now, we're going to see the same thing happening in video if it's done well. And it has to be done well because video is no longer the crown jewels of digital entertainment. It's one of a number of competing entertainment formats, and it has to earn its right to retain its primacy as the fulcrum of mainstream entertainment experiences. So an example of how this works with the new iteration of international hits is there's some DNA that we can extract here that has a common thread running through the leading services, of the leading experiences and how they are delivered through services. And fundamentally, fandom is absolutely central to this. The release strategy, incredibly important. Timing of the release strategy, the ability to create content narratives and experiences and polarizing perceptions of the value of that content alongside knowledge exchanging and alongside the perception of getting a return on investment of consuming that content all lead to success, or the alternative if it's not done well in the digital entertainment landscape. Now, excuse me, the final part of this this piece around community is looking at an emerging feature which MIDiA believes is going to be central to realizing the ability of community to deliver that elevated fandom experience, and that's the watch parties. Thus far, watch parties have been more about shared viewing experiences, but actually they are so much more. They are a gateway pivot into digital behavior that has never been previously experienced by video consumers, but is mainstream in adjacent behaviors such as games. So a classic example of this is in-app purchases. We don't have in-app purchases in video. In-app purchases are the bedrock of monetization for the games landscape. Right now, it's challenging to consider how you'd integrate a in-app purchase dynamic into a mainstream TV format on a subscription service. But once you figure out how to do that, you then normalize that behavior and you provide additional ways for the consumer to actually engage, not just with the content, but with the fandom IP underlying that user experience. And this is fundamentally what it's about. Watch parties create the opportunity to then go deeper around fandom, to then go deeper around shoppable TV, to then go deeper around self-actualization in a digital context through buying digital skins, replicating the success of Fortnite for being able to create personalized brand IP in the digital landscape. So really important vector going forwards for building this community-based experience. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with some implications now. So, not a lot, there's only 4 implications here, but it's always worth reiterating the fundamentals. And the fundamentals here is, yes, content is king. Absolutely it is, but the context matters now more than it's ever mattered before, because video is competing against every other single format in the digital landscape. You've always had to go to where the consumer is, but you've not just got to go to where the consumer is, you've got to be able to deliver the experience at the time and place and choosing that works for them. Do that, and video retains its central role as mainstream entertainment. Get it wrong, and then it becomes one of many different types of entertainment experience, and it's fighting for the same limited share of attention time as all the other competing media formats. Underlying all this is the role of community. And community is historically something which has either been left to marketing functions or deemed to be of secondary importance to the content experience. But as we pivoted into the digital era, it's now become front and center. There's a quote which MIDiA uses to kind of describe this transition, where we talk about content is king, but distribution is queen, and she wears the trousers. That's a Jonah Peretti quote from BuzzFeed. And that was delivered 10 years ago, that far-sighted understanding of these dynamics. But it's more relevant than ever because distribution is absolutely key to getting the content in front of the consumers, and fandom is the glue that holds them together. And the functionality that enables that fandom is what decommodifies the experience and makes the consumers not just engage, but stay engaged and stay vested in your ecosystem rather than jumping out of your ecosystem and going to another competitor for a similar fandom experience. So super serving users is as important as growth, because we're no longer in the growth era. That's the brutal reality. Outside of Asia Pacific, other markets are going to be focused on retention, getting the value, increasing the price elasticity of those existing subscribers. Doing that will allow the economics to start rationalizing, will allow that painful process of dampening of margins over the last 15 years for the TV experience to plateau and then start to increase again, because we move beyond traditional subscription or advertising models, and we actually move on to what MIDiA calls the third way of monetization, the ability to bring in all these different experiences that are digitally native, can only exist in a digital context. And we know that they work for digital consumers because we have games as a clear example of how that has worked and how that has delivered incremental value to the wider entertainment landscape. And with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. We have time for one question, maybe. Anybody has a question for Tim? Daniel, I'm coming with a microphone.
Thank you. Thanks for this. I was wondering, who is creating the fandom? I mean, is it always the producer? Can it be the operator? Who is the best to create this buzz around a show? Or maybe it's not even a show.
It's a really good question. And the optimal answer is a partnership. You can't really actualize it without both parties being involved. And it's not just the show, it's the universe around it. So the classic example that we talk about is Disney, how well Disney has done to be able to create fandom experiences that then create all these spin-off synergies. And they don't just do it on the TV format, of course, they do it long form, they do it film format, but they also have a merchandise business which is hugely successful for that, and IRL theme parks. But you have to, they own the distribution and they own the content commissioning. Both parties need to speak to each other because there will always be that tension between the production company and what they want to get out of the experience and the relationship and the distributor. The distributor, it's more clear-cut why they would be incentivized to be able to build fandom because it's that retention piece, it's decommodifying it. The production companies have to recalibrate what the long-term value proposition is for what they're creating. Now, it's been complicated by the Netflix's model of basically getting universal rights over an extended period of time and paying cost plus to be able to ensure those rights. Now, that created a short-term financial boom for the production companies, but it created a long-term challenge because they couldn't then take that content and sell it into additional markets in the traditional model. So actually, it binds them into a experience where they only have one provider, as a one partner to potentially sell to in a unipolar licensing model, but they also have the challenge that they can't actually build that fandom piece. It's all down to Netflix. So in an ideal scenario, you have both parties working together to realize what the potential implications are for the fandom experience and growing it. I mentioned Squid Game earlier on. Squid Game is a really good example of this because prior to Netflix commissioning Squid Game, it spent 10 years for the showrunner trying to get it greenlit in its home market in South Korea. And they couldn't get the traditional pay TV ecosystem to invest in that dystopian episodic experience because it didn't really fit squarely with their traditional 4-quadrant commissioning structures. Netflix paid for it to be made because they were number 2 in the South Korean market at the time, and they had that localization strategy they communicated to the markets. They also saw the opportunity to be able to extend the fandom beyond the core South Korean market globally. The production company put a lot of time and thought into the iconography of the experience, the building the fandom around not just the visuals, but also the relevance of the content and also the zeitgeisty appropriateness, to the extent that I've forgotten the name of it now, but the youth wing of the biggest trade union in South Korea dressed up as Squid Game guards during a protest against the South Korean government,
Tim,
providing free advertising. And
I fear it's not a countdown anymore, it's a count up now.
Okay. I'll stop there, sorry.
Big applause for Tim. I mean, this man obviously knows what he's talking about. Thank you for being with us. Find him in the coffee break or at lunch. More discussions to be held.